Peace is a prerequisite for cross-border connectivity or cross-border collaboration and for people-to-people connectivity, which is also a prerequisite. I can tell you from my interface with ASEAN, which has been deep, that ASEAN has a very elaborate framework, and it has two elements to it. It took a long time to develop an understanding amongst its members, and Greater Mekong region is also a subset of ASEAN, as you know. They really worked hard at trying to develop an understanding of how peace can be nurtured. They may not have wars as they were brewing together, but there were lots of tensions within that bloc. But what was good about it, that they have developed an intergovernmental process where they deliberate on peace at the Foreign Office levels and the related security level. And then they have a whole scheme of intergovernmental deliberations which take place on different sectors. So I can tell you that when we started the debate of sustainable development, as you may know, sustainable development inherently is actually got a huge amount of agenda on cross-border. But it's not just infrastructure connectivity. It tries to look at elements such as the trade, which is a missing link within our architecture between, I mean, we have had discussions, but it's been very, in my view, poorly managed and poorly handled, despite some evidence. But ASEAN is working hard on 3-4 tracks, like disaster management. There is a huge amount of work that goes on. It's been they invited me to talk about sustainable development, to understand the agenda itself at a very early stage. And the foreign ministers got together and endorsed that agenda and came to a common page. Now, when it came to infrastructure connectivity, we developed for them a master plan for transport. And we, of course, talked to them a lot on the energy connectivity. That did not move that fast. And it still is stuck. I mean, I've been out of that for the last 5 years and I haven't checked. But it was very difficult, despite my dialogue with individual countries and with the ASEAN Secretariat. But when it came to the other agenda, it was easy to navigate, particularly the sustainable development. They love peace. They love to talk about climate. They love to talk about all the issues that matter in terms of the social cohesion and all that. And I think those are, and this would be my last point, that actually I think what we do is, in our regional cooperation dialogue, we immediately jump into the hardcore stuff, and we are inefficient, and Central Asia is more inefficient than us, because Central Asia was my full region under me during the transition period. I can tell you that even if Uzbekistan has opened up or whatever, it takes a hell lot of time, the bureaucracy, to get this right. So Pakistan has to understand that, yes, of course, it is positioned as cross-border connector. But it's, I personally don't think that we can take that for granted. It has the potential, absolutely, but only if we can build the narrative on geoeconomics more strongly so that it takes precedent over geopolitics, as Mohit just pointed out. Without fixing, of course, geopolitical dynamics, where we are surrounded by troubled, fragile states, which are historically least integrated, particularly on trade side. And also people-to-people connectivity has improved now, but it's not that substantive as far as I can tell. And also, we have to learn from successes of other regional cooperation models, Europe, ASEAN, and other platforms. What lends me confidence today is that, of course, we have some projects which are in the pipeline, as Ali has pointed out. Work is underway on these 30 projects. But if you go threadbare into it, most of them are still in the planning stage or feasibility stage. There are few on which work has started, but if you add up the 2 decades that we have lost and the cost increment that's being built in it, and what eventually will be the cost of it, I'm not sure what the economics is telling us. So we need to change the way we work. And we have to also, another point we need funding for these projects. Multilateral development institutions are providing us funding for basically non-project thing, policy-based loans. We have to divert that policy-based loan to investing in infrastructure. If we were to say, we want from World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and whatever other agencies we are going to deal with, we want a dedicated fund for regional connectivity. I think we would have a very powerful funding source which can be deployed without being disruptive to all of us. And last point is, connectivity doesn't happen without having the cross-border technical details sorted out, whether it's the customs administration or it's got to do with the transport connectivity, which has so many protocols, or for that matter, in case of power. I have been working with the region when I was there about trying to develop a power grid, which could eventually be able to move variable energy, because we wanted them to move on renewable energy. So I think it requires a lot of strategic thinking. And I must confess, although I'm not within the government, I don't get the sense that there is that intellectual or technical ministry's input into the design of some of these things going on. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts.
No, thank you for sharing them. I think the kind of detail and the granularity that Dr. Akhtar talked about is something all of us need to be invested in. Those are the issues that actually make the transition possible from just talking about an issue to actually understanding what it would take. One of the people on the panel, and this goes for pretty much the entire panel, but Ahmed, you actually have also worked for a substantial period of time in the ASEAN region, and of course, your current job is about connecting people. That's what telcos and technology is all about. Many of Pakistan's complaints about itself, about not having the kind of export profile that we should, those can be solved through dramatic improvement in what we export to the world in terms of technology, products, and services. Again, this is one of those things, just like regional connectivity, we've been talking about for, it feels like almost 2 decades. And yet the reality is that, the FBR will come and shut down the country's largest telco head office. That, there's many other things that have happened, including to Telenor. Even, people complain about Zong not being touched, but I think even Zong suffers when some of the decisions around spectrum auction and taxation are taken. So in an environment that seems to be hostile to technology and telcos, how are we supposed to be hopeful about digital connectivity? And again, Ali, that's a question I'm going to bring back to you. But Ahmed, sitting in the position that you're in, how do you put on a smiley face and pretend that this is actually doable in the environment that you currently operate in?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for finally getting to me on the 3rd attempt. Telecom sector is kind of used to getting ignored when we talk about infrastructure, which is sad. So I almost gate crashed at the event this morning. I called Asfar and I said, listen, you're talking about... And how come... Okay. So I called Asfar and I said, listen, how come you're talking about infrastructure, but you don't really have anybody from the telecom sector? And that's the legacy mindset. Right? We have to change that mindset because infrastructure is not just roads, hospitals, schools, it's also digital connectivity. And telecom is not just a sector as we have traditionally looked at it, it's a sector of sectors. So this sector will enable education, this sector will enable health, this sector will enable banking, it will enable commerce. And when we only take a very limited view of it, we end up making the wrong decisions, as the government has in the past, and I'm saying it very non-partisan manner. We look at telecom and smartphones as luxury convenience factors. These are essential services that we must afford to every single Pakistani. And as we are seeing what's happening in Balochistan and Sindh and even Punjab in the floods, your reliance on connectivity and communication is at the same level as it would be in a war level. So what we have to change in Pakistan, unfortunately, we're already late to the party, is the mindset around telecommunications and the need for robust digital connectivity, a robust, expansive digital infrastructure. And if we continue to keep on looking at it as a governmental value capture, whether it is through the spectrum fees or right-of-way issues that all of the telecom fiber companies face, then we are basically going to be milking the cow today. And we can't afford to do that anymore. Now, most of us, perhaps even in this room, will have an impression about the telecom sector. It must be extremely profitable because everybody has a phone. There are 190 million SIM connections. Every person has a smartphone, which is actually factually not correct. Only 50% do. But while we have made a lot of progress over the years, in cricketing terms, I would say that our run rate is improving, but it is not at the required run rate level. And some of the comparisons, and I hate to make comparisons with India, unless it's Babar Azam and Virat Kohli. Other than that comparison, I'm kind of hesitant making comparisons with India because I think that train has already left the station. India last week had a 5G auction where they raised $19 billion. In Pakistan, there isn't a 5G case even if the spectrum was offered free. So this is how far we have been left behind. And in most of the comparisons, with the exception of affordability, Pakistan digital readiness or internet readiness is at the last quartile of every single comparison we make. Certainly not a position that I would like to be in, I would like our industry to be in. And while we're talking about regional trade and regional connectivity, eventually the commerce will happen in different ways from how we have looked at it in the last 20 years. And we are underinvesting and we are looking at this particular sector in a very jaundiced way. And we have to urgently fix our way of thinking, our way of looking at it, and recognizing the importance of this particular sector in the future of Pakistan. The thing that you hold in your hand, I keep on saying it's the remote control to your life. You will get educated on it, the smartphone. You will do commerce on it. You will get medical advice on it. You will obviously talk to each other on it as we have in the past. But it is a lot more than just a communication tool. Unless we change that mindset and unless we actually have an ambition as a country that there should be a smartphone in every hand and an internet in every home, we were not going to fulfill any of the connectivity ambitions that perhaps this forum would like to achieve and this country deserves to achieve. So that would be my plea. I still have a smile on my face because every single day we get up, we have to try to convince our colleagues in the government, whether it's this government, previous government, or future government. And it's not that they do not recognize the importance of it. I think we operate in a complex environment where we have imperatives, and some of those imperatives are governmental value capture in the short term. And that is very misleading. The World Bank has shown that whenever there's a 10% increase in broadband penetration, there's a 1.4% increase in the GDP of the country. That's the right lens through which we have to look at it. Pakistan needs digital connectivity. We provide, by the way, I read it somewhere that 130,000 kilometers. I think we have about 70,000 kilometers. Yes, we are connected through 6 cables across the sea. But our infrastructure within the country is woefully weak. And I think that's where we need a different kind of lens to look at this.
Thanks so much, Ahmed, and also thanks for being patient and waiting despite me teasing the audience and you with your name. Everybody was really anticipating that presentation. and it was well worth the wait. Thanks. Dr. Musaddiq Malik, this brings us to you. I wouldn't call you the final speaker because we are going to go back to Ali and ask him to explain and dilate upon some of these issues, because I think the paper does address some of them, and I think that we need to think through these things more carefully. But in the position that you're in, one of the conversations that you and I have also had is the potential for what Pakistan can gain in terms of its energy mix. And of course, I've heard you speak about this, but I'd love for you to, again, expand on those opportunities, but also tell us what you think is realistic and what it is that you need from the group here, from the audience here, in terms of thought leadership or public discourse that'll enable you to be able to achieve the connectivity that will lead us to where we want to go in terms of our economic growth. Dr. Musaddiq Malik.
I think the first thing that we need is the participation of a few more ladies. I'm glad you gate crashed, my friend, and now I know why you were interrupted a few times. But I really wish a few thought leader women had also gate crashed the party. And I wish our governor, esteemed ex-governor, had been on the stage. I think it would have looked good. I would just share with you two perspectives real quick. The first is the energy perspective, and the second is the trade and growth perspective. And obviously they're interrelated. It's been said a number of times here that countries don't grow, regions grow. And whether it be NAFTA or GCC or ASEAN or Mercosur, no matter how you cut and slice, you've begun to see all across the world that the regions are growing. And in order for regions to grow, in order for a particular country within a region to grow, the lifeline of growth comes from energy. Or may I say, one of the lifelines for growth comes from energy. And therefore, it is not an accident that you have an 8,700 kilometer long gas pipeline, the West-East pipeline, which takes the Turkmenistan gas through Xinjiang province all the way to Shanghai. It is also not an accident that you have the National Unification Pipeline, which is 5,000 kilometers long in Brazil, or the Trans-Saharan Pipeline that connects Nigeria with Algeria, which is 4,000 kilometers, or the Yamal Pipeline, which takes the Russian gas and through Poland and Belarus takes it all the way to Germany. It's because if we are going to grow, and if we are going to grow as a region, then many things have to be integrated. And one of the more important things that needs to be integrated is the energy infrastructure. It needs to be leveraged. So Pakistan also requires both its energy portfolio to broaden, as well as its trade links to expand. These are two very important things. When you look at Pakistan's energy sector, you find that Pakistan has near about 90% exposure to the GCC. So what is the problem? Most of our energy needs, whether they be the LNG needs or the petroleum product needs or the crude, is all coming from the GCC. Well, there's a risk there, and the risk is the Strait of Hormuz. And that's just a 70-kilometer wide kind of little canal through which our entire energy comes through. And if for some reason, for some kind of God-given, God-created reason or human-created reason, if this 70-kilometer canal or the passage is choked, we're going to be tough out of luck. And therefore, it is mission critical strategically for us to broaden our portfolio of energy. Now, in order for us to broaden our portfolio of energy, we began at some point in time to look around. And we found a very important thing which has already been mentioned. We found out that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have enormous hydro energy potential. We also found out that Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and most of all Turkmenistan, they have fossil fuels enormous fossil fuels. Turkmenistan, I believe, is one of the largest gas reserves of the world now. So we said, what is it that they need? And we found out that they don't have any passage for exports. They are land-bound, landlocked, and they cannot export their energy, and they also cannot export their other factor inputs. And what is it that we don't have? We don't have the energy. We have people, we have infrastructure, reasonable infrastructure. I won't say a world-class infrastructure, but reasonable infrastructure which is ready to grow. But starting from, if you look back over the past 20 years, you find out every 6 to 5 years, 5 years, 7 years cycle, we go into darkness. We talk about so much energy, and then we go into darkness. Then we build up energy, then we say so much energy, then we go into darkness. So this cyclicality is costing us a lot. By one World Bank estimate, just a few years ago, we were basically losing about 2.5% of our GDP simply because we did not have energy. We need energy. They have energy. We have ports. We have infrastructure. We can export. They want to export. So it appeared to be a natural kind of, there appeared to be a natural synergy. So we started a bunch of projects a few years ago to diversify our energy risk. We started with CASA 1000. This was the Tajikistan and the Kyrgyzstan hydro energy. And we cut a deal or structured a deal where we could have access to anywhere from 1,000 megawatts to 1,300 megawatts of low-cost energy. And as my friend told me today, when we initially began, Harun told me, it was a 3-cent energy, very inexpensive energy. But when you started to load the security costs onto it, by the end of it, it became a 13-cent energy, which was not worth anyone's while. So 3 cent was okay, 13 cent was not. And what stood in the way was the cost of security. So this energy we can only have through Afghanistan, and the cost of insecurity or instability in Afghanistan was about 10 cents. So there's so much for CASA 1000 or 1300. The second project that we initiated was TAPI. TAPI was Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline. It was a brilliant, fantastic project, very large project. Some people believe that it was simply there to mitigate the IP, the Iran pipeline project that we had initiated. But other people have a broader view, and they think, no, in itself, it was a fantastic project. This was a 1,850-kilometer long project, which was worth about, which would require an investment of about $10 billion. But that was not the kicker. The kicker was not that the project required $10 billion. The kicker was that we could have access to most of that energy that was going to flow through the pipes for less than $500 million. And of those $500, the only amount that we had to invest in the way of equity was $200 million. So for $200 million, we could have 1.3 BCDF of gas from TAPI. So what went wrong? What stood in our way was Afghanistan. The same problem that we had with CASA 1000. We had the cost of instability. We had the cost of insecurity. And when you build the cost of instability and insecurity into what otherwise looks like a fantastic program, what do you end up having? Nothing. So what do we have? Nothing. We still have that paper plan, which is not going anywhere. The third project that we had was Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline. And this was another very good project, 780 kilometers of pipeline that would connect Gwadar all the way to Nawab Shah for about $2.2 billion. And we were well on our way. And what happened? What stood in our way? What stood in our way was regional instability again. So we had Iran. Strategically, what we wanted to do was diversify our portfolio. We want to mitigate the risk of the Strait of Hormuz and diversify our energy portfolio. And we found out, exploring everything, that in trying to mitigate that risk, we assume the risk of Afghanistan's instability, and we assume the risk of sanctions on Iran. So it didn't work very well. Now I'll basically shift gears. I'm not going to talk about, because I don't think today's topic is about the diversification of energy portfolio, because we have a fantastic renewable energy program which would use our indigenous resources to diversify our energy. But that's not the topic for today, because you're talking about regional connectivity. I can talk about it if there are any questions, but not for right now. But I would suffice to say that it is such a fantastic program that the government of Qatar has committed an enormous amount of money into that renewables policy, new policy that we're putting together. So hopefully we'd be able to absorb their investment appetite and bring in a lot of foreign investments into the renewable energy, and that would diversify our risk to a certain extent. I would now just take a couple of minutes and talk about growth. Our growth mantra is going to come from the aspirations, our aspirations, as well as the aspirations of our neighbor China. China, for its own political stability, requires a balance, an economic balance between the eastern provinces and the western provinces. Therefore, they're committed to basically growing their western provinces, having growth, I believe, from 3% to 13% or 12% is their target of growth for the western provinces. And the only connectivity, much like Central Asia, or one of the connectivity pathways goes through Pakistan all the way to Gwadar. So that basically, as you guys know, the Belt and Road Initiative, therefore, is mission critical for the western provinces to grow. And Gwadar is the exit to ocean. Other than Gwadar, there's no exit to ocean that they have in the way of growing their western provinces. So our entire initiative, CPEC initiative, as well as the port of Gwadar, become very important. So we have a chance. We can, if we can basically draw the energy from the Central Asian states. We can possibly put a train at Gwadar and use that train, the LNG train, to begin to export LNG and not just become the importers of energy, but start to participate with the Central Asian countries to become an exporter of energy from the Gwadar site. That could be one thing. The second important and interesting thing could be Chinese participation in this gas pipeline and setting up, so to say, a petrochemical city or cluster around Gwadar. And that basically is an area in which Pakistan can also participate, the private sector, the multinational corporations, the Chinese, and the CPEC. The entire belt can participate, and we can build up a petrochem downstream industrial cluster and become exporters of that. Obviously, if we do these two things, many other things would happen. And all of these corridors, the economic corridors and the industrial parks that we've planned around the CPEC, kind of the entire length of the way, they would hopefully come about and energize Pakistan. And for that energizing Pakistan towards economic development, we would have the energy required. We already have the manpower, and we have a reasonable infrastructure that we will unleash towards our growth. In summary, in regional connectivity and regional growth, and Pakistan's position in that regional growth, what is the asset that we have? The asset that we have is our geopolitical situation and our foreign policy. What is the problem that we have? The problem that we have is our situation, location, and our foreign policy. So I would only finish by saying that one of the ways of finding security is through peace. And perhaps this is the time to try it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. I'm really glad that you did what you did and the way that you did it in, because that brings us back to Ambassador Ali Jahangir Siddiqui. Ali, with your permission, I just want to lay out what's going to happen for the rest of the evening. One, I'd like you to maybe walk us through a few of the challenges that were posed in the conversation, not so much to what you're proposing, but certainly to the idea of regional connectivity. I think Moeed spoke about it quite cogently, and I think part of what Dr. Malik presented was also maybe a counterfactual, or certainly a resistance that is innate in those projects, particularly Kaza, TAPI or TAP now, and the gas pipeline. Maybe address those, but also talk about how you've conceived in this paper, because I think one of the most interesting things you did was you distinguished between electricity and gas, whereas in most cases when we talk about this, we bunch it together. So do explain what the logic of how you broke down those four connective tissues was, and also give us a little bit more hope than what Dr. Moeed Yusuf and Dr. Musaddiq Malik are willing to concede this evening.
I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. If I miss answering one of the counterfactuals, just please remind me. I think let's start with what the Honorable Petroleum Minister was saying, which is he came up with a business case that works. So I think the thesis was that just a gas pipeline may not have a business case, but were we to add on one of two or three things, in this case, putting an LNG train, so some of the gas can be exported and we make more money doing that than the cost, then that's a sensible idea. Or having China participate in taking some of the gas that way. So the idea is that there are business cases to be made. And this leads to what you said, what you asked about, Musharraf, why was energy separated into two? Because the business cases of electricity and the business cases of natural gas are quite different. In the case of natural gas, our economy is configured for natural gas. We produce enormous quantities of fertilizer from natural gas. That's a feedstock. It's quite hard to change that. It's possible, but it's incredibly expensive. So we need a certain amount of natural gas in the system simply to produce fertilizer. The alternate is we buy a lot of fertilizer and import that, which is more expensive, but we've spent the money on these fertilizer plants. Fertilizer plants happen to last really forever. You do capex maintenance on them and it just lasts forever. So we have that installed. We have to produce fertilizer. We need gas. Our own natural gas is declining. So the question is, are we as the government solving the problem of availability of gas, or are we solving the problem of the price of gas? When we speak about just the business case on the basis of price, I don't think that's accurate. We have to first solve for availability of gas, because without it, we will not have fertilizer and many other things. We have new gas-fired, highly efficient power stations, and they need to be fed with gas. And regardless of gas being expensive, those plants are so efficient that they will still be competitive. So the case for gas is very clear. It's first a case of availability to run our economy, and second, it's a case of financial business case for which, as the Honorable Minister pointed out, there are some add-ons and alternates. The case for electricity is less clear. There is a non-financial benefit to having an interconnected electricity grid, which is for frequency stability, which is if there's a problem on your own grid, you can take help from a grid you're connected to. But in our case, that is a small gain. Because it's a small gain, I think the bulk of the electricity argument is an economic one. And the electricity, it is true, A, it's seasonal, and B, it is not so cheap. Although at the moment our electricity prices are very high, we should work on bringing those down. But nevertheless, having said that, electricity cables are not terribly expensive. So for TAPI, the idea was if there's going to be a secure corridor carrying a gas pipeline, we're going to secure it anyway. Just above it, we may consider an electricity line, and below it, a fiber optic line. So that's the general point on the business cases. We have to develop business cases, but in some cases, it is an essential thing for us because the alternate is incredibly expensive and, of course, as the Minister pointed out, dependent on bottlenecks like the Hormuz. Now, with regard to process, I think that there was a number of comments made around process, saying it can't be done because of this hurdle or that hurdle. Well, we've had a close relationship with China for most of our independent life as a country. But that relationship did not crystallize into much beyond a defense relationship. until CPEC was created. And how did that happen? Very slowly at first, then very fast. And that was a function of leadership in politics. It was a function of China's own desire. And ultimately, in less than a decade, we spent close to $30 billion of development money. So I think this is a question of, yes, it's been many decades we've been speaking about it. For a long time, we've tried. Yes, there are many hurdles, but we have to define a process that actually makes it work. I would not be one to give up. So what is that process? In the case of CPEC, we had joint working groups with China, political buy-in from both sides first, then joint working groups, interministerial coordination on both sides within the joint working groups. And then, of course, there was the availability of money and resources from China. I'm not saying we can follow the same route because we don't have the same dynamics or resources, but let's start with something small. Let's start with some low-hanging fruit that we can deliver to demonstrate to the other countries that despite all of the challenges that were highlighted and others that we have not yet done, we can deliver something. And what would that be? I would pick digital connectivity. My point on our domestic infrastructure in telecoms was it's far superior to Central Asia and Afghanistan. And once it's in the ground, we can upgrade it. So the point is, a fiber optic line is cheap, and it gets buried under the ground. And you have to worry less about it being a problem from a security perspective than a gas pipeline. So let's bury a high-speed fiber optic line, connect to the Afghan system and the loop they have, and reconnect it in the north, and start providing connectivity. Let's give that as a test case. This project will cost in the scores of millions of dollars on either side. And it can be delivered quite fast, and that pipe would be buried. And that would be a great first step to show what can be done without forming the complex infrastructure, the soft infrastructure of project delivery, of a joint working group, of lots of financing, of the soft infrastructure. And I must acknowledge the work of the Commerce Ministry, and Swale Faruqi Saab is here from there. The soft infrastructure, which is already being put in place, but without all of that, we can just connect it. So I would say there's some low-hanging fruit to demonstrate what can be done, and then we work on the bigger projects. I'll make one final point, and I'll hand over to you, and please tell me if I missed something. I feel quite let down by the generation before me. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, in the face of all of these problems, which I will argue are less in the case of regional connectivity today than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But in the face of all these problems, do we not tackle the problem? And do we let our children be disappointed with us?
Thank you, Ambassador Siddiqui. I think, I was going to make the point, and I think I would like to reiterate it. I think I don't think there's any cynicism. I think what Moeed said and what Dr. Malik said are absolutely right. And I don't see Haroon here anymore, but, he's worked a lot on process. And, it's very clear that the Pakistani state, as it's configured today, is simply incapable of conducting the sophisticated and nuanced and detailed negotiations and engagements that are required for doing this with multiple countries. I think you're right to acknowledge the Commerce Ministry. It takes an entire division and, like all of their life force to focus for a sustained period of time to manage this with one country. And I know Faruqi Saab is working on multiple countries right now in the run-up to the SCO conference, which is going to be another opportunity for us to integrate this into our national thinking. But I do think that just because something hasn't worked for a long time is no reason for us to throw in the towel and say, this is never going to work. I think the fact that the business case isn't compelling, Moeed, is all the more reason for a group like this to really be interested in this conversation, which is my way of asking you to now, A, respond to the multilateral question, but also to maybe explain your realism a little further, because I know that you're not a pessimist.
Thank you. Since you singled me out, and I think the sitting minister, I don't want to leave an impression that Pakistan's moving in some other direction. Look, the point is, I invested more time on connectivity. I think Commerce Ministry sitting here, I see the Foreign Office together than perhaps anybody at that time, looking at this strategically. The point I'm making is that much of the conversation we've had and what Ali is saying, it's a given. I mean, there is no option but to move in this direction. So, throwing in the towel is not even a conversation. I think the starting point of the conversation goes beyond Ali's paper, because there is no debate on that this is what needs to happen, and these are the potential projects, areas where we can go. Let me say 2 or 3 things. Again, you're going to call me a pessimist, but I really want to point out where we were getting stuck. Ali says digital connectivity is the low-hanging fruit. There are people in this audience who will bail me out. It took us months to agree how to get a truck from Central Asia into Pakistan without a hassle. It took us months to get to a point where an Afghan truck would be allowed to go to Karachi and a Pakistani truck would cross over into Central Asia. The point I'm making is, I think the problem is we have tried to do big things without having any foundation to show that this can work. There's a lot of cynicism, there's a lot of people who say, well, this is just not worth it, and that's not where we want to go. So I think if Ali were to write another paper or one of us would do it, here is what I would say. Let's take 5, 6, 7, 10 doable things in the next 2 to 3 years. Point out the business case, but then draw up an action matrix to say who has to do what to get us there. I think that will then drive this conversation beyond, no, it can't happen. I think in some of the comments we're hearing, it's again the same thing. Geopolitics has to fix itself to go to this. I don't think it's going to work that way. It's too complicated in this region. So you've got to come at it from the business case and then move forward. Just 2 other quick points. One, I think we need 2 conversations, and 2 very healthy, constructive conversations. I don't know, Asfar, maybe your group can do this. One is a public sector, private sector conversation. How does the private sector convince the public sector that they have to lead this and the public sector has to facilitate? And with all due respect to everybody, I mean, I was part of that system. We have to get out of this mindset that the private sector needs to be regulated, otherwise they're going to run away with things and something's going to go horribly wrong. We only need to facilitate, and the private sector has to find that business case. That's one. So public sector, private sector conversation has to happen. The second one is a conversation with the people who put up this business case and the economists in the room and the business people in the room and the security. So people like me and people who are arguing, Ali is not that, but a lot of the executives sitting here, there is no conversation. So what happens? You create a plan in your world on how connectivity should happen, right? So we've heard this project will happen because it has this much gas is going to come through. I will look at it and say, sorry, somebody can blow it up. No, the border's not ready. There's, I have a geopolitical. We need to sit down and figure out where that sweet spot is. Because all of Pakistan's connectivity issues are going to be resolved through a political economy lens, neither a security nor an economic lens.
Thanks. I think that element was missing in the conversation. It's valuable, and I'm glad you brought it up. Minister Saab ki ijazat se, because I do want to bring you back into the conversation, Dr. Saab. लेकिन ये प्राइवेट सेक्टर क्योंकि बात हो रही थी तो मैं चाह रहा था कि गयास खान फिर से जो है इसमें आपने काफ़ी ये you heard a lot of the sort of both the case for perhaps connectivity optimism, which might be a new term, and connectivity realism. I think if somebody was to ask me where I'm leaning, I think I'm certainly leaning in the direction that the leadership in this conversation has to come from the private sector, because the public sector is constrained by a number of factors. We've talked about some of them. There's a long list. Riaz, do you see that emerging as a reality, or do you think there are not enough world ambition level businesses in our country that just won't happen, that people are too busy? I shouldn't even say rent seeking. I think lots of businesses are too busy trying to survive in their domestic markets, in their local markets. So how do we get a business sector, a private sector, business leaders that are ambitious and hungry enough to be interested in this conversation and then to lead the conversation? Because जो लोग अभी तक lead करते रहे उनसे ये काम नहीं हुआ है. I think that much acknowledgement is certainly merited. Yes?
Yeah. So I think it's a great point and number of things that need to happen. First of all, we have to understand that capital will go to opportunities which give the best risk-adjusted return. If you're going to have rent-seeking opportunities in the country, and, you know, blame all the companies for it, including Anglo perhaps, I'm being very open about it, why would businesses take risks, right? And that is the responsibility of the government, which drafts policies and creates an enabling environment. So I completely agree with the notion that private sector has to lead, but the government needs to create an enabling environment by removing these inefficiencies which are there in the market, by getting out of business, and by coming up with long-term policies which will stand the test of time. When investors come and invest in with a particular government in charge, and the next government comes and questions it, that breaks confidence. So I think if you want this to prosper, remove inefficiencies, penalize undocumented sector, government should get out of business, deregulate as much as possible, and come up with long-term policies, whether it's in petrochemicals, whether it's in agriculture, overall industrial policy, what have you. And then also be mindful of the fact that when you're creating when we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about international investments, and I can tell you that if a company like Engro wishes to invest more than $10 million in a country outside Pakistan, it will go right up to the cabinet for approval. And that's okay, because the reality is that we are very cash strapped, right? We're in a massive foreign exchange crisis situation. So it's kind of understandable. But when you put regional connectivity front and center for economic growth, which is an important pillar for national security, then you have to think this through over decades, right? And I guess that's what it comes down to.
No, I think that's quite a brilliant point and a great segue. Amir, this issue of random new taxes on cell phones or on phone calls or on data, this is exactly what, in a sense, Ghias also acknowledges, and I know you do too, that the government has legitimate revenue needs. And so, जब ज़्यादा प्रेशर होता है FBR पे, सियासी लीडरान से, तो वो जाके जो है, उनको पता है सबसे आसान ये है कि क्योंकि मल्टीनेशनल्स हैं और इनके ऊपर ये टैक्स लागू करना आसान है, तो आके जो है वो नया टैक्स ठोक देते हैं. They're not doing it out of hatred for regional connectivity or hatred for connectivity or hatred for digital. They're doing it because of the compulsions of that moment, just like the compulsion to restrict the so-called capital flight if big firms were to start investing in USD denominated, in currency, in US dollars. So really, we know that ये कभी-कभी legitimate होता है, ये जो हरकत होती है हुकूमत की या सरकार की. इसका longer term, do you see any kind of way out? It seems like we keep talking about many issues, and regional connectivity is one of them. And then we go back to our offices, whether it's the minister or any of us, and we have to deal with the urgency of the moment, and we forget this. How do we shift the mood and the pace and the cadence of the conversation कि regional connectivity jaisi cheezein, they stay on the top of the discourse mountain, and we start to frame even our urgent issues within that framework? Do you see any hope for that?
Listen, taxation, of course, we're weak in taxation. We should be taxing more as a country. Our taxes to our revenue are woefully less compared to our peers. लेकिन ये जो आप बात कर रहे हैं कि टेलीकॉम को टैक्स किया जाए, in the context of connectivity मैं बात करना चाहता हूँ. It's more about predictability and transparency of policies that we need. You go through a spectrum auction, there's a certain view that you take, and you look at a 15-year horizon. That's how you make a business case. And I'll try to put it together in the context of foreign direct investments and also local investments. what does an investor need? And then again, bring it back to the private sector. They need predictability, right? If you go on Excel, you can tweak around with cells and say, well, in this year, this thing will happen. When we take a lot of U-turns in our policy making, the investors will shy away. Whether they are foreign investors, they're big investors, small investors, and foreign investors will shy away even more because they're not familiar with the lay of the land. So where we struggle is bringing in more investment into Pakistan, because what is a foreign investor going to do? He's going to call somebody who has already invested. A company like us, we've been here 27 years now and invested close to about $11 billion. So the biggest visiting card that Pakistan would have is a company like Jazz. Foreign investors will call us and they will ask us about our experience. And now let's go back to taxes and these things. We fully understand the government's need and right to tax. It's about making that very conscious trade-off. How much do you get today at the cost of depriving ourselves of something in future? And I think we have not made sensible trade-offs over there, especially in the context of telecommunications, in the context of internet proliferation. Even after 7 years of 4G auction in Pakistan, today we have less than 50% 4G penetration. During this time, we've invested close to about $3.2 billion on 4G. But the payback hasn't arrived. Today, 50% of the handsets still sold in Pakistan are 2G, वो जो पुराना Nokia feature phone होता है. तो हम स्मार्ट नेशन, स्मार्ट कनेक्टिविटी, डिजिटल पाकिस्तान की बातें करते हैं. जब तक हम अपनी पुरानी गलतियों से सीखेंगे नहीं, हम आगे नहीं बढ़ सकेंगे. और इसमें अगेन द आइडिया इज़ नॉट दैट regulators or tax people should not regulate us or tax us. It is more about taking a holistic view about what the country needs. And that's the trade-off where I think we are really not making the right choices. And these kind of bad choices, maybe Ali was talking about, what do we leave our kids? Do we leave our kids, again in this context, with a टूटा-फूटा internet जिसमें वो पढ़ाई नहीं कर सकते? जब कोविड हुआ सबसे ज़्यादा आ गया हमारे ऊपर प्रेशर कि भाई आपने प्रोवाइड क्यों नहीं किया इंटरनेट. वो इसलिए नहीं किया क्योंकि उसका इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर लगाने में जो राइट ऑफ वे के जो चैलेंजेस हैं वो बहुत ज़्यादा हैं पाकिस्तान में. एंड अली, जस्ट टू करेक्ट यू लिटिल बिट ऑन योर थिंग, even infrastructure, the fiber infrastructure, once you lay it, it still gets cut. You work through Sindh and Balochistan and you see people will consciously cut the fiber, and they will cut it multiple times and hold the telecom companies ransom. And today, our biggest worries are not to be connected with the rest of the world. Whenever there's a sea cable that goes down, we have an issue. And we have had issues in Pakistan. Right now, we have issues because parts of Pakistan are not connected because the fiber has been cut. So we just need to take a holistic view and balance our short-term needs, legitimate needs. I would not say that the government wakes up every morning to penalize Jazz or the telecom sector, but it is just an easier sector to tax. Today, a Pakistani citizen pays close to 34% tax on internet usage. And we want to educate our kids through or digital education. Now imagine कि अगर आप किसी जगह किताब ले रहे हैं और उस किताब के ऊपर 34% आपका टैक्स हो, ये क्रिमिनल चीज़ें हैं जो हमें चेंज करनी चाहिए और ये इसकी प्रिडिक्टेबिलिटी जो है वो इन्वेस्टर्स को दिखानी चाहिए.
Good. I'm glad that the diplomacy that you had in the first round of conversation has begun to give way to some candidness. By the time dessert comes around, I think we'll be flying all guns blazing with Amir Ibrahim. मिनिस्टर साहब, आपकी जो प्रेजेंटेशन थी, मैं आपसे थोड़ी सी ये लिबर्टी ले रहा हूँ और ऑडियंस के साथ भी, क्योंकि आई हैड प्रॉमिस्ड दैट वी वुड गो टू द ऑडियंस and I know that we're running short on time, but I think, there's some things you might want to say in response to some of what's been said, but B, I think I'm going to ask you to maybe comment on the likelihood of us being able to step back and think more holistically. Holistic thinking की बात मेरे ख्याल है 3-4 speakers ने की. Certainly आपका जो private sector है वो आपसे ये इल्तिजा कर रहा है सरकार से और इस माशरे से कि थोड़ी holistic thinking करें ताकि हम सब big scale पे grow कर सकें. Do you anticipate a political compact in any way, shape or form given where we are today? Please be as optimistic as you possibly can be, and as soon as you're done speaking, I'll take the mic to the crowd and we'll bring some other questions in.
I think I must not have, I'm not a good communicator because clearly the message that you've received is not the message that I wanted to give. There's no pessimism here. It's very clear that if you want to solve a problem, you have to understand the nature of the problem. and shying away from the problem is never going to get you to the solution. So you have to look into the eyes of the problem and solve it. I'm reminded of this, my favorite story, where a professor was writing and the chalk fell from his hand. He said, "Damn gravity." Then he bent down and he picked the chalk up and he looked at the class and he said, "But you know what? Gravity doesn't care." So my friends, gravity doesn't care. Every time we let go of the chalk, it shall fall, because that's the nature of gravity. But once you understand gravity, like we understood propulsion, for hundreds of years, human beings tried to fly. They put wings on their hands, they put wings on their heads, they tried to jump and flutter, and they fell on their head and crashed, up until they understood the principle of propulsion. And as soon as they understood the principle of propulsion, you had 1,000-ton vessel fly more elegantly than an eagle. And I think what we're trying to do here is understand the dynamics and understand the nature of the problem, not towards any pessimism, but towards hope, towards understanding how to solve this problem and move forward. I personally think that we have not given up on any of the projects. Whether you call it TAP or you call it TAPI, I was just talking to the ambassador around the table, and we've had many rounds of conversations, and no one, neither they nor us, have given up on it. And now with the new kind of framework that they have, where there's already a pipeline coming into Herat, we are right now exploring all possibilities to take that gas from Herat and bring it into Pakistan. We are thinking about all the framework conditions, making whoever, ensuring security through making the administration partners or certain companies partners, or finding investments from Pakistani perspective, from indigenous resources, from our gas companies. We're exploring everything. So nothing has been written off. But all I'm saying is that we don't have to deal with all of these problems if we start to rethink about the region. If you're going to talk about connectivity, if you're going to talk about the region, then we have to take the regional view. And we have to understand what's gone on, what's gone wrong with the region. And we have to fix it. And the only thing that we are bringing forward, or I'm trying to bring forward from our government's perspective, is that we are creating and committed to, invested in a new framework of peace, where we would be able to work through Afghanistan, and we would be able to tap into the enormous resources in Central Asia and have the gas flow into Pakistan and have these LNG trains and have the export and have these industrial parks. I don't see any pessimism in that. I see hope. But I do believe that we'll have to rethink the region from a new lens, the lens of peace. And that's what we are doing. That's what we've been trying to do for some time. And I'm hopeful, if it's taken as long as it has taken to get where we are, it would take us a little bit time to move away and reconfigure the region. And I think we're all partners. The Central Asian states are partners in it. I think Afghanistan is partner in it. There are hopeful kind of negotiations going on between the Western powers and Iran as well, and who knows where that would end up. But all of these corridors eventually are going to open up. And once they open up, all those ideas of Gwadar being the hub, the gateway to the ocean, the exports, the infrastructure, the GDP growth, all of those things are going to come about. So please do not consider the analysis of the situation from the lens of pessimism, but from the lens of solving the problem and getting to the growth that our kids deserve. As Ali was saying, if we have disappointed our children, or our previous generations have disappointed this generation, let's not continue to do that. Let's look at the problem, solve the problem, and make sure that our future generations are proud of us. And that's basically where we are heading. In terms of the holistic thinking, I think the framework that I tried to present to you, I tried to the best of my capabilities to make that regionally holistic. Within the country, in terms of the private sector, I think it's a difficult time. I do believe we have problems. We have problems of infrastructure, of processes. We've not been able to expand our tax to GDP ratio. We're trying to do that. we're also going through a very difficult time when the responsibility that was given to me, when I walked into the office on day one, we were in commercial default. PSO is one of the largest companies that we have in Pakistan. And at that point in time, I was shying away from this because I didn't want the markets to panic. But as I walked in, my first meeting was about the PSO LCs not getting confirmed internationally. So if a company like PSO cannot get its LCs confirmed, you can imagine how far we were from default. So we're making difficult decisions. I think our partners, the large corporations and the private sector, they're taking the brunt of it with us. And we are very hopeful that as we straighten out the economy, as we move forward, and every passing month it's going to be a better situation, and every coming budget is going to be an enabling budget for growth and prosperity. We committed to it. We commit this to all the multinationals as well as to the local investors in Pakistan. I mean, we have a high tax rate right now, but that shall come down. But that would come down as we basically stabilize the country. The country first, then the companies, because of both of them put together are the recipe for prosperity of the poor people of Pakistan, and that's what we committed to.
Thank you, Minister Saab, for, I think, articulating things in the way that you did. I'm particularly taken and admire the calm and the reassuring tone that you have. I do think that it is a troubling time, especially given the natural calamity that has befallen millions of Pakistanis over the last couple of weeks and that we're seeing play out through the floods. So it's good to have a steady and calm and reassuring set of hands at the wheel. I think before we break for dinner, I think it's important to engage what is an audience that could easily replace, the stage probably 3 or 4 times in terms of how senior and influential people here are. There might be specific questions that you have, and there might be generic questions. If there are, please raise your hand, and somebody will bring you a mic, and we'll ask you a question. I'm also conscious of the gender imbalance on the stage and in general in our country. So I'm particularly keen on beginning the question session by addressing that imbalance, but we also don't want to inorganically force the issue. Start with the gentleman in the fetching tie.
पूरी जो डिस्कशंस हो रही हैं उसमें हम 3 बातों को बड़े बार बार कह रहे हैं, हॉलिस्टिक, ऑप्टिमिज्म, पैसिमिज्म, लेकिन और फिर हम फ्रेमवर्क की भी बात कर रहे हैं कि जी हमें इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का फ्रेमवर्क और करना है. लेकिन मेरे ख्याल से इसमें जब हम पूरा एनवायरनमेंट देखते हैं और जो अर्ली का आर्टिकल है उसको भी हम रिव्यू करते हैं तो उसमें नज़र आता है कि हमारे पास मल्टीपल मेगा बिलियन डॉलर प्रोजेक्ट्स हैं और वो प्रोजेक्ट्स ओवर द ईयर्स हो रहे होते हैं, लेकिन हमारे पास पॉलिटिकल अनस्टेबिलिटी या डिसकंटिन्यूटी ऑफ पॉलिटिकल एनवायरनमेंट की वजह से हम बहुत सारे इनिशिएटिव्स को कंप्लीट नहीं कर पाते. तो इस सिचुएशन में हमारे पास जो लीडरशिप है उनके पास क्या सॉल्यूशन है कि अगर हमारे पास पॉलिटिकल एनवायरनमेंट चेंज होता है या गवर्नमेंट चेंज होती है तो ये जो हमारे मल्टी बिलियन डॉलर इनिशिएटिव्स हैं ये कंटिन्यू रहें और उनका जो रिजल्ट है, जो फ्रूट है, वो हम ले सकें. आपके इसके बारे में क्या राय है?
आपका किसी मखसूस शख्सियत से ये सवाल है या you for every, so for whoever wants to answer that question, maybe डॉक्टर साहब अगर आप इस पे बिस्मिल्लाह करें.
देखिए मैं आपको 3 पर्सपेक्टिव्स आपके सामने रखूंगा जो इस वक्त हुकूमत का फोकस है. पहली चीज़ तो ये कि हर चीज़ जो अब हम करना चाह रहे हैं और जो करने जा रहे हैं दैट वुड बी प्रोडक्टिविटी फोकस्ड. सो हम ये बिलीव करते हैं कि अगर पाकिस्तान को आगे बढ़ना है तो पाकिस्तान को की प्रोडक्टिविटी जो है हमें बढ़ाना होगी. और एक वक्त की प्रोडक्टिविटी तो टेक्नोलॉजी या किसी मल्टीनेशनल कॉरपोरेशन के ज़रिए टेक्नोलॉजी ला के इम्प्रूव की जा सकती है, बट लॉन्ग रन में प्रोडक्टिविटी सिर्फ इनोवेशन इंजन से बढ़ती है. सो पाकिस्तान की इनोवेशन कैपेसिटी जो है, दोनों एब्जॉर्प्टिव कैपेसिटी ऑफ इनोवेशन एज वेल एज इंडिजिनस इनोवेशन की जो कैपेबिलिटी है उसको बढ़ाने के लिए काम किया जाएगा. और इस सिलसिले में बहुत सी पॉलिसीज़ सामने आ रही हैं جن میں سے کئی چیزیں ایسی ہیں جہاں پہ ایک طرح سے ونڈ فال پالیسیز بنی ہوئی تھیں. تو ایک لیول پلینگ فیلڈ کریٹ کرنے کی کوشش کی جا رہی ہے ایلوکیشن آف فیکٹر ان پٹ کے ذریعے. اور جب لیول پلینگ فیلڈ ہو جائے گا تو صرف وہ جیتے گا جو پروڈکٹیو زیادہ ہے, وہ نہیں جس کو فیکٹر ان پٹ سستا مل رہا ہے. تو ایک تو یہ آئی تھنک ایک چینج ہے جو ہم سامنے لانے کی کوشش کر رہے ہیں. دوسری جو چیز اہم ہے ہمارے لیے وہ ہے کہ پاکستان کو تھوڑا سا ایکسپورٹ فوکسڈ ہونا پڑے گا, کیونکہ ہمارا ایکسٹرنل سیکٹر جو ہے اس کی وجہ سے یہ پرابلمس جن کا آپ ذکر کر رہے ہیں بار بار ہمارے سامنے آتے ہیں. ہمارا ایکسٹرنل سیکٹر جو جب آؤٹ آف لائن ہو جاتا ہے تو ہمیں اپنی گروتھ کو تھوڑا سا کنٹین کرنا پڑتا ہے, گروتھ کو سلو ڈاؤن کرنا پڑتا ہے, اور پھر تھوڑی دیر کے بعد جب سیکٹر تھوڑا سا ہماری امپورٹ ایکسپورٹ کا بیلنس جب برابر ہوتا ہے پھر دوبارہ سے ہم گروتھ شروع کرتے ہیں, پھر 4-5-6% پہ آتے ہیں تو پھر دوبارہ سے پتہ چلتا ہے کہ امپورٹس بہت زیادہ بڑھ گئی ہیں کیونکہ ہماری تمام ریسورسز باہر سے آ رہے ہوتے ہیں. تو دوسری جو اہم فوکس آپ کے سامنے آئے گا ادر دین پروڈکٹیوٹی اینڈ لیول پلینگ فیلڈ, وہ آئے گا ایکسپورٹس کے حوالے سے کہ ایکسپورٹس جو ہیں وہ فوکس میں آئیں گی. تیسری جو اہم چیز آپ کے سامنے آنے والے وقت میں آئے گی وہ یہ ہے کہ ہمارا انحصار جو ہے وہ انڈیجنس ریسورسز پہ بڑھتا چلا جائے گا. مثلا ابھی بھی جب ہم قطر بھی گئے ہوئے تھے تو جو چیزیں ہم پروموٹ کرنے کی کوشش کر رہے تھے وہ انڈیجنس ریسورسز تھی, مثلا سولر انرجی یا ہماری ونڈ انرجی کے حوالے سے. ویسے تو بہت سی اور بھی چیزیں تھیں جن کو ہم نے پروموٹ کیا ہے, لیکن ہمارا اب انحصار جو ہے ہم کوشش یہ کر رہے ہیں کہ ہمارے اپنے جو ریسورسز ہیں ان پہ ہمارا انحصار بڑھتا چلا جائے. یہ 3 چیزیں ہیں, مگر ان تینوں چیزوں کا محور جو ہے وہ غربت ہے, کیونکہ پاکستان ایک غریب ملک ہے. تو پاکستان کے اندر ہمیں یہ دونوں چیزیں ساتھ کے ساتھ لے کر چلنا ہوں گی. جس طرح امریکہ میں یا ویسٹرن سوسائٹیز میں ہم کہتے ہیں کہ ایونچولی دی اکانومی شیل ٹرکل ڈاؤن ٹو دا پور پیپل, وہ بات ٹھیک ہے, ان کو سوٹ کرتی ہے, ان کے پاس اتنی اسٹرینگتھ ہے اکنامک کہ ایونچولی جب وہ غریب آدمی تک پہنچے گی تب تک کے لیے غریب آدمی کو وہ بچانے کا سامان کر پائیں گے. ہمارے لیے یہ اہم ہے کہ ہم جیسا آگے بڑھیں اپنے غریب لوگوں کو ساتھ لے کر چلیں, جن کو اللہ نے صاحب حیثیت نہیں بنایا ان کو بھی ساتھ لے کر چلیں, اور صرف یہ جو ٹرکل ڈاؤن ایک فریم ورک ہے صرف اس پہ فوکس نہیں کریں. تو یہ میں نے آپ کو بتا دیا, محور بتا دیا. محور ہے غربت اور غریب آدمی, اور اس کو اونچا اٹھانا, اوپر لانا, اس کی کیپیسٹیز بلڈ کرنی جس میں کمپٹنس ہے, جس میں ایجوکیشن ہے, کیونکہ اسی سے پروڈکٹیوٹی بڑھے گی. اور یہ سب کرنے کے بعد پروڈکٹیوٹی, ایکسپورٹس اینڈ انڈیجنس ریسورسز, یہ ایک فریم ورک ہے جو اس وقت کی حکومت کے سامنے ہے.
Thank you, Minister Saab. I think, Ali, maybe you want to comment on this as well?
جی, ایک چھوٹا سا کامنٹ ہے میرا, وہ یہ ہے کہ کچھ حد تک جو آپ کا سوال ہے وہ ایڈریس ہو جائے گا اگر یہ چارٹر آف اکانومی سیاسی پارٹیاں آپس میں سائن کر دیں. تو وہ پرپوزل ہے, ہم سب جانتے ہیں اس میں ہرڈلز ہیں کچھ, لیکن آئی تھنک آج کے لیے نہیں ہمیشہ کے لیے ضروری ہے کہ تمام پولیٹیکل پارٹیز اگری کریں کہ جو بھی آپس میں ان کے اختلافات ہوں یا الیکشنئرنگ ہو, کچھ بنیادی چیزوں پہ وہ رکیں گے نہیں اور لڑیں گے نہیں.
Thanks, Ali. Dr. Moeed Yusuf.
I think just want to amplify جو علی نے بات کیا ہے, I was going to come at it a different way. دیکھیں بات یہ ہے, sorry, I've never been known to be diplomatic. کوئی بھی پاکستان کا پرابلم, کنیکٹیوٹی کی آپ بات کریں, بٹ اینی پرابلم is not resolvable in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. So if you ask me, we have gotten into this habit as a country, as a nation, as a society. Government. It's irrelevant. کچھ ایسی چیزیں ہیں on which we have to agree, یہ ڈائریکشن ہے, یہ کام کرنا ہے, عذاب بھی آ جائے تو یہ کام ہوتا رہے گا. But I have to tell you, again with all due respect, I think we're simply not mature enough to be there. میں پالیٹکس کی کوئی بات نہیں کر رہا. By the way, I'm not talking about today or anything. I'm talking about basic structural policies. میں آپ کو اس طرح پریزنٹ کرتا ہوں, جب کم از کم میرا پہلا ایکسپیرینس تھا گورنمنٹ میں. The first inclination I had was to come and say کہ میرے سے پہلے والوں نے کیا کام کیا ہے وہ مجھے دیں. I want to see what of that can continue and we can build on. And the response was, why? You have to make your mark. So you have to first nullify what the other has done and then move on. This is immaturity. This has nothing to do with policy. So we have to find a way, sorry, but to, as a system, to grow up and know कि कुछ चीज़ें 3-4 साल में solve नहीं हो सकती. No matter what we do, वो 10 साल, 15 साल process चलेगा तो फिर होगा. Let me also just make one more very provocative point. पाकिस्तान की financial management और economic management 90% is preordained. वो हमारे कंट्रोल में नहीं है. डेट वापस करना है, कुछ कर, टूल सिर्फ 5 से 10% के लिए. सो जो भी आ जाए, अरस्तु भी आ जाए, वो वही काम करता है. लेकिन पहले दूसरे का नलिफाई करना है, फिर खुद करना है. वी हैव टू कम आउट ऑफ दिस माइंडसेट. ओनली देन वी कैन डू व्हाट अली इज सेइंग.
मैं मजीद कोई तबसरा नहीं करूंगा डॉक्टर साहब. जी नहीं, बिल्कुल मैं ऑनेस्ट नहीं होना चाहता इस वक्त. आई वांट टू गो बैक टू द, देयर इज अ फ्रेंड राइट देयर, आई कैन सी यू थ्रू द कैमरा. तो वहां तक अगर हम माइक ले जाएं. एंड आर देयर एनी अदर? ओह, वी हैव, okay, so we have two, sir, we have two here. We're going to go there. We're going to collect 3 questions, the brother, and then madam aap aur phir aap dono. Ji, bismillah. Keep going. और आगे. Okay, if we don't have a mic, आप खड़े होके सवाल पूछ लें, मुझे आवाज आ जाएगी.
थैंक यू वेरी मच. एक तो ये कि जो जिस तरह से इलेक्ट्रिक व्हीकल्स और हाइब्रिड व्हीकल्स हैं, आई थिंक उसमें हमें ड्यूटी को देखना चाहिए गवर्नमेंट को. और जिस तरह से सोलर एनर्जी है विच इज़ मोर इंडिजिनस एंड लोकल, और माशाल्लाह मिनिस्टर साहब ने उसका जिक्र भी किया. हम अगर उसको देखें और हम उसे फॉसल फ्यूल्स के साथ सब्स्टिट्यूट करें या लोकलाइज करें और यहाँ पे इंडस्ट्री को प्रमोट करें, एक तो मेरा ये पॉइंट है. दूसरा जो मेरा पॉइंट है वो ये कि इंटेलेक्चुअल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में हमने कोई बात नहीं की आज. Probably this is not the topic probably हमारा. I think with so much of youth and अभी जो emerging capital है, इसमें अगर हम डिजिटल वर्ल्ड को देखें और आने वाले टाइम को देखें, तो दिस इज़ द एरिया, रिसर्च, ह्यूमन कैपिटल, हेल्थ केयर, जिसमें एक्चुअली वी कैन एक्सेल वेरी क्विकली इवन अमंग्स डिफरेंट नेशंस. आई वाज जस्ट रीडिंग अ कमेंट अबाउट इजराइल कि वो विद अ पॉपुलेशन ऑफ जस्ट 9 million, and what is the level of their research output and the innovation they are producing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. If the questions and comments can focus on the connectivity, regional connectivity aspect of the evening, that would be great. Madam, आपने पहले हाथ खड़ा किया था.
Gender imbalance that exists is on the stage right now, which is part of the inherent problem in the country. There is a certain amount of privilege at play here, so forgive me if I must point that out. I have to. I can't do justice to my female, Pakistanis without saying that. So let me just begin there. My question is around foreign policy, so I'll direct it at the ambassador and perhaps you, sir, the former NSA, and then perhaps the government minister. I work for the UK government. It is a part of my job day in and day out to present Pakistan as a business case, the very business cases that we're speaking about here. What I have understood is 2 things. There's the geostrategic significance hand has been overplayed. We need to be attractive, lucrative for people to come to us. People are not coming to us because we are situated. We happen to be geographically situated in a certain place. Now, that may take away a bit from the premise of this conversation here today, but I think it needs to be said. Desires, and our desires particularly, don't pay dividends. Markets reward businesses that are profitable. Regions reward economies that are fast growing and are contributing to the growth of the region, and that is just something that we have to say and set out here. My question is, what are we doing? And I know Ambassador Siddiqui has been doing this in the past. What are we doing so that conversations that feature thought leaders as yourselves in other countries are featuring Pakistan in the conversation, are talking about Pakistan, and this desire for connectivity cannot just be organic to us. It can't be endemic to us. It has to be featured on stages and conversations that are happening around the world, which I can attest to, at least where I see myself, where I see us as a key sort of stakeholder in the IMF program, in the FATF discussions. We see this every day. The mistrust is too large. The murkiness around the country is too large for us to progress beyond, beyond the reputation, and there's a reputational risk. So what are we doing to go beyond that? And if you help me answer that, that will help me build the business case that I build anyway every day for the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for doing the work that you do. There's a question behind you. The light is in my eyes. It's literally right directly behind you. Yeah, there it is. That'll be the last question in this round, and possibly, with due apologies to everyone, maybe the last question overall, because I'm under extreme duress as far as time is concerned. Madam, aap apna sawal please puchiye.
Thank you, Sharif, and good evening, everyone. मेरा सवाल बुनियादी तौर पे उस निज़ाम के हवाले से था जिसके हवाले से मोहित यूसुफ साहब ने भी जिक्र किया कि हमारा जो निज़ाम हुकूमत है, जो वजारतें हैं और जिन्होंने ये इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर और ये कनेक्शन बिल्ड करने हैं, जिन्होंने हमारे फ्यूचर की पॉलिसी बनानी है, उनकी आपस में कोऑर्डिनेशन ना होने के बराबर है. हम बड़े प्राउडली आके कह देते हैं ये विजन 2025 है, ये विजन 2030 है. उसमें माइलस्टोन्स क्या होते हैं, 2 साल, 3 साल, 5 साल, 6 साल, वो कभी भी नहीं बताया जाता, एवेल्यूएट नहीं किया जाता. कैसे कहीं अगर गलती हो गई है तो उसको कैसे दुरुस्त करना ये भी नहीं होता. सिर्फ ये होता है कि एक नई गवर्नमेंट आई है, वो नए स्लोगन्स लेके आ जाती है, तो जो वो जाने वाले होते हैं तो वो सारा का सारा उनका जो भी उन्होंने बुनियाद रखी होती है वो टूट जाती है. तो मेरा ख्याल है कि कनेक्टिविटी के हवाले से भी यही हमारा मसला है. एंड देन दिस डिस्कशन सीम्स टू बी इनकम्प्लीट. हमने मतलब हमारे यहाँ क्लाइमेट चेंज के बहुत सारे मसाइल हैं, पॉलिटिकल स्टेबिलिटी के बहुत सारे मसाइल हैं. अगर आप उनको विदाउट टेकिंग दैट इन अकाउंट, आई थिंक हम कोई फ्यूचर की कनेक्टिविटी चाहे रीजन में आपने करनी हो, साउथ एशिया में करनी हो, अपने नेबर्स में करनी हो, यू वोंट बी एबल टू डू दैट विदाउट टेकिंग दैट इनटू अकाउंट. थैंक यू वेरी मच.
Great points. Thank you, Tanzila. Who wants to take, especially the second question, but there was a mention of EVs and intellectual, I guess, capital or resources. Mohit, one of the questions was directed to you. We can go to Dr. Musaddiq Malik to close, but maybe we start with you, Mohit. Yeah.
So let me sort of sum up what I've heard. Ek to, again, coming from my experience, again, I'd never done this before. I think we have to give a public sector, private sector ki conversation. I have a lot of sort of concerns about how we approach the private sector as public sector. But at the same time, we have to understand that the public sector works day and night for the same cause and does the best that it can. So ये conversation has to be constructive. आपका ये point geo strategy वाला भी बिल्कुल ठीक है, and we understand that. But think of it another way. There is a codified in a policy that was approved by the cabinet, issued by the state of Pakistan. There's a codified consensus that national security is now economic security with everything else built around it. There is a codified consensus that geoeconomics पे और focus होगा. So, yes, maybe there are reasons why geostrategy was so important. It was a rational decision at some point. As somebody who sort of worked on security, I think it's unfair to say that people weren't thinking at that time and just went in this direction. There were reasons. Now there is a reason to move in a particular direction, and we are going there. It's not going to be overnight, but I keep repeating that the business case has to be clear. Uske baad institutional change jo hai, it becomes somewhat easier. But for instance, let me just say this. I've made a lot of not friends, let's put it that way, raising this again and again. moving forward, economic diplomacy has to be the crux of foreign policy and diplomacy, right? But I think if the Foreign Office, the colleagues from the Foreign Office, Commerce Ministry, BOI, others are here, we used to have this debate all the time, and we couldn't figure out whose job is it to run this, right? Because we haven't actually done that in the past. It may have been an afterthought in some ways, but now we have to create structures where this becomes the primary focus. So I think over time this will happen. People realize it. मैं बहुत सुनता था कि जी नहीं ये कभी नहीं हो सकता, कोई कहता था फौज नहीं करने देगी, कोई कहता था नहीं गवर्नमेंट नहीं करने देगी. We have it codified. That means everybody is on board. The point goes back to the original one. Are we ready to take up good ideas and take them forward no matter where they came from? Because economic diplomacy भी एक साल में नहीं होगी, economic security भी एक साल में नहीं होगी, and we've just got to keep moving in that direction seamlessly. वरना ये चीजें I think break होती रहेंगी. And just to tie it to the one other thing I heard, I think the biggest problem, and I may be biased in this, is that we don't have any space in the public sector to think intellectually, to challenge with new ideas, and think beyond tomorrow. You know, we're a country that is caught up in firefighting for obvious rational reasons. We have to create hubs of excellence where intellectual thought challenges what we believe to be the cardinal truth. वो नहीं होता, unfortunately. जितना ज़्यादा होगा, उतनी जल्दी आप ये जो economics और economic diplomacy और उधर जाएंगे.
Yeah, I mean, with the way government works right now, I think that's not going to happen. So there has to be a political commitment to make that happen. We can have this argument, afterwards as well. Ambassador Siddiqui, I wanted to give you the last word after the Honorable Minister, given that you wrote the paper and set the table for us, so I'll let you wrap up. Honorable Minister Saab, आपका जो है वो तीनों सवालों पे आपकी कुछ thoughts जो हैं आप अगर आप share करना चाहें.
मैं तो सवाल ही भूल गया हूँ, लेकिन जो याद पड़ता है बता देता हूँ. देखें, पहली बात तो ये है, आई थिंक कुछ थोड़ा सा हम ये नेशनल सिक्योरिटी का ईडीएम जो है ना इसको ओवर प्ले करते हैं. आई मीन योर इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ पूरी दुनिया ये करती है. वाई वी ऑलवेज एंड अप विद एवरी एनर्जी बिकम्स अ नेशनल सिक्योरिटी इशू, फूड बिकम्स अ नेशनल सिक्योरिटी इशू, फ्लड्स बिकम अ नेशनल सिक्योरिटी इशू. तो लगता है कि हर चीज़ जो है वो नेशनल सिक्योरिटी इशू है. तो मुझे कभी कभी ऐसे लगता है कि अजीब किस्म का कोई पैथोस है जिसके अंदर हम रह रहे हैं, जिसके अंदर हर चीज़ हमारी नेशनल सिक्योरिटी को टेम्पर कर देती है और हिला देती है, और हमें लगता है कि नहीं, कोई इतनी ऐसी ख़ास बात नहीं, दुनिया के ममालिक हैं, हम भी एक ट्रेजेक्ट्री पे हैं, हमें उसमें हर्डल्स आ रही हैं, इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ की हर्डल्स भी आ रही हैं, हम उनको सॉल्व करेंगे. वी ऑल स्टैंड कमिटेड. ये सब लोग जो यहाँ बैठे हैं मुख्तलिफ रोल्स प्ले करते हैं. आई डोंट लुक एट दैम एज इतनी डायर स्लैंट से मैं उनको नहीं देखता कि ये भी नेशनल सिक्योरिटी. तो मैं पूछता हूँ कि वो क्या है जो नामुराद नहीं है नेशनल सिक्योरिटी का इशू. मुझे तो एक नहीं नज़र आता. तो मुझे तो नज़र आते हैं बड़ी सीधी सी चीज़ें. आपने बड़ी अहम बात की ब्रांड के हवाले से. आवर ब्रांड इज़ गोइंग टू बी द कंपनीज एंड द पीपल दैट वी हैव एंड द पॉलिसी दैट वी मेंटेन. इट्स एज सिंपल एज दैट. अगर हमारी पॉलिसी के अंदर सिर्फ वो जियो political angle nahi hoga, which has kind of historically come from not necessarily the economic angle, but from certain other perspectives, I think we'd fare out okay. We have these corporations which are growing. I think we have these people who leave Pakistan, they go all over the world and they become world class as they go all over the world. So I think if we create that environment for the people in Pakistan where they can become world class in Pakistan, then Pakistani people would be deemed world class. I think if we focus on the productivity of our corporations and we encourage our corporations and we don't criminalize making money, and we encourage from rags to riches becomes a story that we also celebrate, then many boys, young men and women, they would rise and move from rags to riches, and we'd celebrate their stories, and that story from rags to riches would be our story, our national story, and that would be our brand. What's wrong with that? Why is it that our situation or our brand has to be far more complicated than the Finland's brand or the Singapore's brand and so on and so forth? There was no geopolitical kind of imperative in Singapore. It was a straightforward country which imported in 2004 or 5, if I remember, $60 billion worth of factor inputs and exported about $170 billion worth of stuff. So the value addition was $110, $120 billion. What is so complicated about that, for Christ's sake? Where does this kind of thing kicks in? Look at Finland, where it was. Finland was a forest just about 30 years ago. And their biggest export was paper and rubber. Look at them now. They're the hub of technology. Where was the geopolitics in that? It was straightforward innovation and competitiveness and productivity and the world, going to the world with a straight face and trying to sell what you can sell with a competitive advantage, and that became your brand. Look at the innovation ecology of the United States. Look at that. Just in the Midwest, there are 10 universities that spend over $2 to $2.5 billion every year in their research infrastructure. In the Midwest, which is neither East Coast, no Harvards, Yales, Princetons, nor West Coast, not Berkeley, UCLA, Stanford, right in the middle of the country, middle of nowhere. They invest $2.5 billion in their innovation ecology. So their innovation strength is what drives that country. I mean, they continuously get beaten up by the by the cheaper economies of or less expensive, or what may I say, where the labor force is cheaper. They get beaten up by the traditional sectors, whether it be steel or textile, and they continuously innovate to biotech and nanotech and this tech and that tech. Where's that coming from? It's straightforward. So keep it straightforward. And if you keep it straightforward, you would have a straightforward brand. They take that straightforward brand with a straight face to the rest of the world, and don't tell them you need us. Tell us we are competitive. Tell them you're differentiated. Tell them you're competitive. Tell them with a straight face that you can do it better, and you will have that brand. Like your physicians have that brand in the US, are Pakistani physicians looked upon as second-tier physicians or second-tier investment bankers or second-tier anything? Not at all. So get inspired and just keep a straight face and go with a straight face to the world and sell the straight product competitively. As far as the last comment, the last, and let me also tell you, that there are very few countries in the world which have developed competitive edge because of factor input. Very few countries. You'd be hard-pressed to find a country which became world-class because they were growing something or they were mining something. There are very few examples. I mean, there are examples of one country after another where they had nothing and they built up stuff because they imported, they added value, and they sold it. So therefore, don't just think about we're here and the gas is going to come. I mean, yes, we need these things and we'll get these things. But what is going to matter eventually is what we do with those things, and that should be our focus. I personally think that in our politics, I think one of the comments was about that. I think our politics is a little bit morbid, I would admit. But I would say that democracy is a competitive marketplace for policy. Just the way competition works in the private sector, in the private sector growth, similarly democracy works in the marketplace of policies. I mean, who says there's no accountability? There's no government has been elected twice in Pakistan. That's accountability. You get thrown out because you do not meet the expectations of the people of Pakistan. That's the competitive marketplace. You go present yourself, you present your slate for the past 5 years, and people reject you and throw you out. That's the marketplace. And I do agree to a certain extent that we need to have some kind of reasonable consensus on reasonability, but not necessarily a consensus on policies. I would bring policies in public interest, and my competitors, the opposition, would rip it apart in public interest and show me the ways which create better public policy. It is ironic and unfortunate that that discussion doesn't take place, and the discussion is about tum ye ho or main wo hu or tum ye ho. But as we evolve, and we get into this marketplace called democracy, hopefully those discussions would give way to discussions on policy, and they have to be as competitive as we expect the competition to be in the marketplace.
Thank you, Minister Saab, especially for that final note of optimism about the maturity of our democracy. Imminently, inshallah, aapke muh mein ki shakar. Ambassador Siddiqui, you get the last word, but remember, you are now standing between a very sort of august crowd and their dinner. So over to you.
Thank you. I'll just address the second question. I think one part of it may not have been addressed. I think if that part was, how do we sell Pakistan to overseas investors, the answer is that in the domestic economy, there is plenty of opportunity, in the rupee economy. And that explains why these automakers from Korea have entered the market. That explains why Hutchison Ports decided to build yet another container terminal in the city of Karachi. So there is foreign investment. It's not as much as it should be, of course, but there is foreign investment in that area. The problem is that, the government has equal sets of incentives, regardless of what you invest into. So the incentive for boosting exports should be much more than cheap gas for exporters. There should be many more incentives to attract them, because that's really the area where we have to sell. So I would just make that small point. I think to some, I would only say that nothing worth doing comes without problems. And of course, holding the realism up high and questioning everything we do and why things have not happened in the past and what the hurdles are is incredibly important. But once we have done that, I think if the goal is something that we all agree on, i.e. there is no option but to integrate regionally, then the only thing I would leave you with is to have a great sense of urgency, because the world is passing us by, and the opportunity we have, both for integration at this moment, may not be present 5 years down the road. So that's what I would leave you with.
Thank you, not just for those comments, but for writing this important piece. Thanks to the entire panel, Amir Ibrahim, Riaz Khan, Honorable Minister Dr. Musaddiq Malik, Asfar Ehsan for bringing us all together as you always do, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, our former National Security Advisor, Ambassador Ali Jahangir Siddiqui, and of course I will let Rabia, or I will request Rabia to take over. Thank you again. Around